Book of Psalms, the third psalm. When we went through the first psalm, we saw a picture of the perfect man, the blessed man. We saw that juxtaposed against the picture of the ungodly, the unsaved. In chapter 2, we see a picture of the rebellious man as the people are rebelling against the Lord. And we also see at the end a picture of the King, a picture of the Son, which is Jesus. And so, we learn from the first psalm that, there is a way to live, that we ought to emulate this blessed man, emulate this perfect man, keep the scriptures in our hearts, and not to emulate the ways of the ungodly. And we ought to be aware that the rebellious man is out there, that those ungodly, they have other plans, they have other desires, they have other agendas, against God's plans, against His will. And so we ought to serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. And that's what we learn from the second psalm in verse 11. Psalm 3 takes a little bit of a different tack here. We see most likely, your Bible probably says that this is a Psalm of David, and it may even give you a little bit more information on that. This is actually one of David's Psalms from when he was fleeing from Jerusalem, whenever Absalom had rebelled, whenever Absalom, his son, was trying to usurp the throne and become king of Jerusalem. So keep that in mind as we read down through these 8 verses. It says, "Lord, how are they increased that trouble me? Many are they that rise up against me. Many there be which say of my soul, there is no help for him in God. Selah. But thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory, and the lifter up of mine head. I cried unto the Lord with my voice, and he heard me out of his holy hill. Selah. I laid me down and slept. I awaked, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that have set themselves against me round about. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for thou hast smitten all mine enemies upon the cheekbone. Thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongeth unto the Lord. Thy blessing is upon thy people. Selah." So, again, we have pretty good evidence, pretty good confirmation that this is one of David's Psalms. And so in order to get a little bit of understanding about the psalm itself, we ought to understand a little bit about the psalmist whenever we can verify who the psalmist is. Ron, I think just last week, had talked about how David was a killing machine. He was a warrior. That was his life. He basically lived outdoors as a child, as a shepherd boy. He spent most of his time fighting the elements, in the Judean wilderness. Bethlehem is there just in the wilderness, and it's not, other than maybe 1.5 months out of the year, there's not really much greenery. I mean, it's a fairly rugged type environment there. So he dealt with the elements. He dealt with wild creatures. He dealt with the lion and a bear at a very young age. We won't go and read all of those details. And as a teenager, he came up and performed a feat that nobody thought possible. With only 5 smooth stones that he gathered, and only the throw of one of them, he was able to defeat a giant man who should have been able to skewer him like that. But he had faith in God, and he allowed God to direct his stone. He allowed God to take control of the battle, and he gave God the glory for his victory. And so began the many the many tales of valor and heroism of King David of Israel. So we have here a man who has had a very good relationship with God, but we also have a man who had a very bad relationship with God. All of these things come after the sin with Bathsheba. This event of Absalom's rebellion. He went up on the rooftop and he saw a woman bathing and he liked what he saw, and so he reached out to this woman and they had relations which ended up with a child. And in order to prevent these things from becoming known, David had murdered her husband, who was one of his valiant soldiers. He executed a formation and put him out in the front in the middle of a bunch of enemies, and everybody else was ordered to withdraw. So only Uriah the Hittite, Bathsheba's husband, was the one remaining person. And this man was a very loyal man to David. And this was a detriment to the kingdom overall. You never want to lose a strong and loyal servant like that. And also, the very sin that David committed corrupted the kingdom. It corrupted his own heart and it corrupted the kingdom. And it was not a positive thing for Israel. So we see that David is a valiant warrior. He's a husband. He's a father. He's a murderer. He's also the one that's called the sweet psalmist of Israel. He is he is responsible for the majority of the book of Psalms. Many of them are giving glory to God. Some of them are bemoaning his current situation and asking God for assistance. Some of them are repentant in him saying, God, I have failed, and I would like to come back to you. So we see this man, he has lived a life. And when I say that, I don't mean necessarily that it's a life that we would want to live. But he has lived a life that is full of many different paths and directions, being inside the will of God and being outside the will of God. He understands a lot about the human life at this point, having gone from the very lowest of the low as a shepherd boy to the very highest of the high as the king of God's peculiar people. So here in verse 1, he says, Lord, how are they increased that trouble me? Many are they that rise up against me. And so you see that this it starts in 2 Samuel chapter 15. And we're not going to spend our whole time talking about Absalom's rebellion, but I do want to go and look at it just very quickly. 2 Samuel chapter 15, beginning in verse 1, it says, And it came to pass after this, that Absalom prepared him chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom rose up early, and stood beside the way of the gate. And it was so that when any man that had a controversy came to the king for judgment, then Absalom called unto him and said, Of what city art thou? And he said, Thy servant is one of the tribes of Israel. And Absalom said unto him, See, thy matters are good and right, but there is no man deputed of the king to hear thee. Absalom said, Moreover, O that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice. So you see Absalom's playing politician here. He's trying to turn the people against David. We move on further down in the chapter. Into verse 7, it says, And it came to pass after 40 years that Absalom said unto the king, I pray thee, let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed unto the Lord in Hebron. For thy servant vowed a vow while I abode at Geshur in Syria, saying, If the Lord shall bring me again indeed to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord. And the king said unto him, Go in peace. So he arose and went to Hebron. But Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, As soon as ye hear the sound of the trumpet, then ye shall say, Absalom reigneth in Hebron. And when Absalom went 200 men out of Jerusalem that were called, and they went in their simplicity, and they knew not anything. And Absalom sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city, even from Gilo, when he offered sacrifices, and the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. And there came a messenger to David, saying, the hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom. And so here we see David, he's basically been overthrown. He no longer has the will of the people. The will of the people is with Absalom. Absalom's desire is to take the throne. In verse 14 it says, and David said unto all his servants that were with him at Jerusalem, arise and let us flee, for we shall not else escape from Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly, and bring evil upon us, and smite the city with the edge of the sword. And the king's servants said unto the king, behold, thy servants are ready to do whatsoever my lord the king shall appoint. And the king went forth, and all his household after him. And the king left 10 women, which were concubines, to keep the house. And the king went forth, and all the people after him, and tarried in a place that was far off. So rather than have Absalom come in with his men, with his military might, and try to stain the walls red with the battle that would ensue, David said, we're just going to leave here. We're just going to evacuate. That way, whenever he gets here, he can have it. We're not going to go through this fighting. We're not going to deal with it. Not here in this city. I'm going to get out of here, and we'll just leave it to him. And so David actually, he had sort of just he had no desire to fight his own son, and we see that. We see that throughout this whole story, and we're not going to read the whole story this morning, but we see that he's heartbroken. We know the story of how Absalom, he's this very charismatic person, and he also has this very long hair that ends up being his downfall. He gets caught in the trees, and he cannot escape. And so then Joab, David's general, he ends Absalom's life and reports to the king. And David it ruins him. He's heartbroken over it because this is his son. It's his flesh and blood. He did not want to engage in violence against his own flesh and blood. He loved his son dearly, even if Absalom did not necessarily love his own father. There are lots of different things that you can get out of that. In the father loves us even though we may not love him. As sinful individuals here on earth, as broken humans, and that he seeks over and over and over again and is patient and long-suffering in order to try to make a reconciliation between himself and us, which ultimately results in the sacrifice of the Son, Jesus, so that we can be reconciled to him in a permanent way. That's just one of the many lessons that are to be learned from this story in 2 Samuel. But we're not necessarily studying out 2 Samuel, we're studying the 3rd Psalm. So those were the events that were going on when David penned this, whenever he wrote these lyrics down. So he's in a very confused, befuddled state. It's almost like mourning. We didn't read it there in 2 Samuel, but later in the chapter you would read that, I think in verse 23, that the people mourned and they wept as the king crossed out from the west to the east, went over the Kidron Valley, across the brook that was flowing at the bottom of the valley, and exited and departed the city. The people of Jerusalem and the people that were following him out behind him of the palace, they were weeping and they were mourning. It was not a pleasant event. And so he's surrounded by sadness. He's surrounded by melancholy at this time. So verse 2 says, many there be which say of my soul, there is no help for him in God. So the people are all rising up against him for the most part of Israel. They have favor with Absalom. And there are people that are saying that not even God can help David here. That there is no help for him in God. It says in verse 3, but thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory and the lifter up of mine head. David says, even in the midst of all these things, the Lord is with me, and the Lord is helping me. He says in verse 4, I cried unto the Lord with my voice, and he heard me out of his holy hill. And that's a little bit poetic there, but essentially it's, he's the, recognizing that the Lord is above us. He is, he is in his holy place. He is in heaven. Now, not only that, the Lord is everywhere. The Lord is in all places, but he's recognizing that special difference that exists there. We mentioned that, in Psalm 2, that in verse 4 it says, "He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh, the Lord shall have them in derision," speaking of these rebellious people, these heathens. And that there is a difference there between people and between God, and that there is that separation there between these ungodly people. Like, they are here and he is up there, and there's this gap, there's this schism between the two. Here, David is not necessarily recognizing this in that way, but what he's recognizing is that God is in fact God, and that he is in fact perfect and all-powerful and good, and that David himself is lowly. And he is humbling himself here before God. So he says, when he says that he heard me out of his holy hill, it says in verse 5, "I laid me down and slept. I awaked, for the Lord sustained me. I was able to sleep and I was able to wake up. God kept me." And each and every night that each of us lays down our head, and each and every morning that we wake up and we have to get to attend to our business or whatever it is that we're going to do, God is sustaining us in those moments. Each and every breath we take, God is sustaining us. It says in verse 6, "I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that have set themselves against me round about." That's it. The next verse, the next verse is a completely different statement than this. That's a standalone statement. "I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that have set themselves against me round about." David is confident that the Lord is going to work this out. Now, we know from the story in 2 Samuel that it doesn't work out the way David exactly wants it to. God has his own way of dealing with this, and it doesn't line up with the way David wanted it to. And there are reasons for that. And we're not going through the study of 2 Samuel this morning, but essentially my personal belief is that the death of Absalom was part and parcel a judgment for what had happened with Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite. That David ultimately ended up, when Nathan the prophet visited him and told him the story of the man who had only one little lamb, and he had the rich neighbor, and the rich neighbor had that little lamb killed, and David he was irate. He was inconsolable. He couldn't stand the fact that this is something that could have happened. And he basically said the man had to repay threefold, that he would have to repay 3 lambs. And Nathan looked at David and he said, "You are the man. You are the man." And that instant, David broke into pieces. David lost 3 lambs, one of which was Absalom. He'd also had the baby with, before Solomon, the first child had been taken that he'd had with Bathsheba. So that makes 2, and so he ended up losing a total of 3 children as a result of this. And I believe he pronounced his own judgment whenever he was speaking with Nathan, and that judgment did occur, and he lost 3 of his own lambs. And those were the repayment for that. And it's a difficult situation, but even in the midst of all that, even in the midst of this, David still is orienting himself toward God. He still ultimately is repentant of his actions and sets himself and sets his heart toward God. And so what we see here in Psalm 3 of David not being afraid of 10,000s of people is a type And David is, if you want to say that Joshua is probably the greatest, or not Joshua, excuse me, Joseph is the greatest type, Old Testament representation of something that occurs in the New Testament. He is the greatest type of Christ that you see, in the Old Testament. Joseph is. There's just his whole life from beginning to end. It's just one big mirror that just reflects Christ all the way through. David is one of the greatest types for the nation of Israel in the tribulation and in the millennial kingdom. And so when we see here David is beset by all these people, it's typified here, and I said a type is something that occurs in the Old Testament that you see again in the New Testament, not necessarily always old to new. Sometimes it's past to present, sometimes it's past to future. It doesn't necessarily have to go from old to new exactly. But we see that he typifies the kingdom of Israel here, and we look at Zechariah chapter 12. Zechariah chapter 12, and we look at verses 2 and 3. Zechariah chapter 12, verses 2 and 3 says, "Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about, when they shall be in the siege, both against Judah and against Jerusalem. And in that day will I make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it." So you have here this group, Jerusalem. Everyone is gathered against it, and that's sort of like how David feels. He's got the whole nation against him. In this case, the whole earth is against this nation in Zechariah. And then in chapter 14, verses 2 and 3, it says, "For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half of the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations, as when he fought in the day of battle." Everybody's gathered together. It seems like we're losing. It seems like everything's going the wrong way. And that's how David feels, but he says God's going to turn it around. And that's what God ultimately does for the nation of Israel here in Judah and Jerusalem, in these future events. And so David here, throughout this event with Absalom, is typifying the nation of Israel and the things that they would go through in the future, which still at this point in history that we are in right now in the present are still future events. It says in verse 7, back in Psalm 3, "Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for thou hast smitten all mine enemies upon the cheekbone. Thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly." Now, I don't know if I haven't really ever been in a serious fight myself, but I have been hit in the face a couple times. And getting hit on your cheekbone isn't a very pleasant experience. That'll take you out if it's in the right place. And so he's describing that, God he's wiped the floor. He has taken care of business. He says, "Thou hast smitten all mine enemies upon the cheekbone. Thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly." He's saying, "Lord, you've taken care of business for me, and I'm so thankful." Is basically the message there. It says in verse 8, "Salvation belongeth unto the Lord. Thy blessing is upon thy people. Selah." So he is recognizing here in this moment, in this time of turmoil and pain and anguish, that only God has the power to correct the situation. That only God is going to be able to turn things around. And he's recognizing God's past glories, and he's praising him and offering him glory for that. And he's asking again, "Deliver me from this. Save me, O Lord." And he recognizes that salvation belongeth only unto the Lord. That only God can provide this salvation. And that, this actual physical salvation from this circumstance, this historical event that took place with the Absalom's rebellion. Only God had the power to deliver in that. And also from our sins. Salvation belongeth unto the Lord. We can't make enough money, do enough good deeds, give enough away, write enough hymns. We can't do anything in and of ourselves to advance further down the path of salvation. We are incapable. It is not within our God-given abilities to do so. Salvation belongeth unto the Lord. Jesus is our salvation. What he did for us, that is our salvation, not what we do for God. Salvation belongeth unto the Lord. Salvation isn't something that you can just pull out of thin air. It only comes from God. It doesn't come from Buddha. It doesn't come from Muhammad. It doesn't come from Confucius. It only comes through Jesus. And that's it. He is the way and the truth and the life, and no man comes unto the Father but through him. So he recognizes that salvation, and he believes that salvation is there. He believes that it's present in that situation, and he believes that God is going to take care of things. As he says, thy blessing is upon thy people. He does not believe that the nation is going to be completely destroyed. He believes that God is going to preserve it for the future. So that his blessing will remain. So that is the third psalm. We have a little bit of time this morning. Does anybody have any questions or comments?